A whole new global talk show, Newstellers. Let's meet our panelists. We are already in December. This year has absolutely flown by. Yes. What do you think is the most impressive story you've written this year?
Well, I don't know how impressive anything I've written is.
It's like trying to pick who's my favorite child. I don't know how to answer that.
But maybe not the most impressive, I cannot judge, but the most interesting for me was a story I wrote about esports. Because I discovered how developed is a professional gaming world in Korea, and interview players who spend their days like playing 20 hours a day. That was interesting. That was really
pretty
interesting.
Crazy, isn't it?
For me, it was. I had my special one. I interviewed one old South Korean guy who was going to meet his sister after 60 years of separation in the Korean separated family reunion, and only talking to him and see his illusion, I think was the most special one for me.
A very personal one.
Yeah.
I have to agree with Atta. I think the most kind of meaningful story I did was interviewing a man who was participating in the separated family reunions in October. It was it was kind of an emotional talk with him. It was really great to hear his story, and I'd really like to follow up with him actually to see how it went just from on a personal level.
This year there hasn't been like one of these really massive news stories that goes on for a really long time, like there were in a few previous years in Korea. But I guess for me the story that is most memorable was when U.S. Ambassador Mark Lippert got stabbed.
Right.
Just because, like, just as a kind of a fluke, I just interviewed him like 2 days before that happened.
Oh, I see.
And so I was just finishing up my story, and then all of a sudden my story became a lot more urgent. And so I was able to write the sort of the news about him having been attacked, but also like include like all this information I had from my interview with him. And so that's probably the story that I remember the most.
Okay, quite a range of topics.
Yeah.
All right. Well, shall we get into today's topics for Newstellers? They are protest culture and the spoon class concept. I'm sure you've seen many protests in Korea also.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Every day.
All right, well, in Korea, many protesters gather in the Gwanghwamun area, holding candles in support of a common cause. But let's have a look at examples of demonstrations around the world. Recently, there has been debate about the state's use of force during violent protests in South Korea. Some critics say Korea should learn from the demonstration culture of developed nations. In the UK, the Million Mask March saw thousands of protesters dressed in Guy Fawkes masks, protesting against restrictions on freedom of the press and capitalism. During the violent demonstrations, a police car was set ablaze and at least 50 protesters were arrested. In Germany, protesters also turned violent at a massive rally to protest against austerity policies, and police cars were set on fire also. There are calls for a better communication channel between the government and the people before learning from demonstration techniques of developed nations. So protests can and do sometimes get violent. I know that there has been a lot of news recently, particularly in the US, about violent protests and the use of excessive force by the police. Jason, do you have anything to add on that?
Well, I think some of the demonstrations that have turned violent in the US, I mean, it's over outrage against police violence. So, I mean, it's this really horrible cycle here where, you know, a shooting occurs. You know, we saw of course, outside of St. Louis with the Michael Brown situation where an officer shot this unarmed African-American man. That sparked, you know, weeks of protest that turned into rioting. In Baltimore, after the police were involved in a killing of another African-American man, we saw more violent protests there. But yeah, unfortunately, this is kind of a phenomenon in the US, especially recently, about anger against the police, you know, violence leading to more violence.
A problem we have in France, I mean, protests are usually peaceful. The problem we have is sometimes you have people who don't really care about the cause, or they don't come here to protest, they just come here to be violent and to break the shops, to have a fight. So this is an increasing problem we have now. And even when I was a student and sometimes we were protesting, then at the end of the protest, you have always a lot of people who really don't have any political purpose. They're just here to get into fights.
So there's violence on both sides then. Is there any particular fixed standard that you think is too violent in either on the protester side or on the police side?
Well, sometimes both of them, they overact and they get violence when they shouldn't be. In the case of demonstrators, yeah, sometimes, as Fred said, there are some people that just like violence and like fighting, and they go there and finally they are doing a weak favor to their cause, because finally all the people get against them and the image of the demonstrators, it's kind of gets worse, right? So then in the case of police, sometimes they also repress the people much more than they should, and that happens in Spain a lot. You know, the police is more violent than they should in a lot of occasions.
All right.
Well, I think freedom of assembly and freedom to hold outdoor events like that are important democratic rights. And I think if you look at a lot of cases of violent protests and you look at like how they actually popped off into violence, you'll find that the police were infringing upon people's rights to assembly and to move freely.
Okay.
If you look at the recent protests in Seoul, like even before those protests started, the police set up a bunch of barricades throughout Gwanghwamun to impede the protesters' movement.
Yeah, but that doesn't make it. I mean, I was shocked to see the picture of in Korea in the recent protest in Seoul. The protester who had like ropes to pull the buses. They were attacking the police with bamboo spears. They were breaking the police buses. I mean, the police was not violent. Okay, they set up these buses, but that doesn't by itself constitutes violence.
No, it doesn't. But I just think if you had a reasonable police response to this, and you didn't have huge barricades, and you didn't set the terms of the event right away, like we're not going to respect your right to assembly. I'm not here to excuse, you know, a lot of the violent stuff that went on, like throwing iron bars at people and breaking police. I don't agree with that, but. If you started the whole event by saying like, okay, you can walk around like you want, and we're not going to intervene, and like, of course, if somebody damages a police bus, they should be arrested, of course.
In the case of Spain, we had a lot of times we discover with videos and other things that there were some secret police instigating violence inside the demonstrations, because they know that if there is a protest against the government and it gets violent, people is not going to support that protest. So the government is the first who is interested in having violence in some demonstrations. Not always, but sometimes.
I covered the 2008 protest against the re-import of American beef here to South Korea quite extensively. And you know, what I saw, you would have protesters really antagonizing the police. They wanted the police to crack down. I think South Korean riot police, despite their overwhelming numbers, are actually very well trained and very well, you know, disciplined. Unlike back in the 1980s when you had really serious police crackdowns on pro-democracy protesters. But you would have these kids, you know, rushing up to the police and, you know, about to hit them. And, you know, they wanted to antagonize the police so that they would hit back. And then, you know, you have people with cameras or cell phone cameras taking pictures, and that can be uploaded to, you know, your back in 2008.
Also in 2008, things went out of hand. That was
yeah, but even, I mean, as long as a protester, if you go to a protest preparing bamboo spears and ropes to pull buses, I'm sorry, this is not acceptable. This is not peaceful. You're going there to have a fight. Maybe maybe it's a minority, but this minority, as you said, is really is bad for their cause. Like I mean, there is a culture of protest, and that brought democracy to Korea. So I think time changed. Now it's It's not. We don't have to fight the police like in the past.
But I mean, like you have a government that's carrying out unilateral policies that are anti-democratic.
But
this history textbook thing was not something that...
By fighting the police, then you should protest, but you should not be violent. As soon as you get violent, then it's
violence
over.
is not a good thing.
Nobody listens to what you have to say because you became violent.
So I think fighting violence with violence is never going to produce a good result.
Yeah, I mean, and
we keep seeing this vicious cycle.
As Atta said, like as soon as a protest movement becomes violent, they lose public support because it's so easy to depict them like, You know, those videos of the Minnochong Korean Confederation of Trade Union guys ramming a ladder into a police bus. I mean, like, if that's shown on the news, no reasonable person is going to say, "Oh, I really sympathize with those guys." You know, they're being really reasonable.
Okay. So I think there's very different perceptions of the efficacy of protests, even amongst our panel. There was an interesting protest held in Spain last April. Citizens were demonstrating against a controversial law which banned protesting outside government buildings, claiming that it put heavy restrictions on freedom of expression. The interesting part was that virtual protesters in hologram took to the streets, adding this very unique twist to the rally. Over 2,000 people participated in the virtual march by sending in photos and videos of themselves protesting. So we're seeing some diversity in the means and delivery of demonstrations. So do you think this will open up more appropriate communication channels between protesters and the people they're directed at?
It was a very good idea to raise awareness about what the government of Spain was doing. Mm-hmm. And the government of Spain was restricting the freedom of expression and the freedom of demonstration. And they made this law called Ley Mordaza. It's called gag law. So they wanna just shut up people and make people not protest. They imposing really high sanctions to people who is protesting or people who is filming the police when the police is abusing their duties. Next government will for sure derogate that crazy law.
When I was in Spain maybe 10 years ago, it was when Spain sent troops to Iraq with the US, and there was a lot of protests in the street. And when I was in Barcelona, one way of protesting was people go on the window, they take a stick and their casserole, and they just make noise.
Right.
And everybody does that. All the city does this at the same time, and it's so noisy. And it's not violent, it's fun, it's a bit festive.
I agree, Fred, that we are creative people, but I have to say that we copied that from Argentina. that was originally the cacerolada. That was originally created by Argentinian people who are really creative people too. In the year 2000, when they had that really crazy big crisis, they lost their money from their banks. So it was their way to protest every day against the government, against the corruption there.
Okay, so it's actually pretty effective in getting the point across.
It's creative, but I still just feel that if you can't come out onto the streets yourself, then it's maybe not a cause really worth protesting for. And I know there's legal restrictions that prevented them from coming out onto the streets, but I think if you really wanted to make a point, you would defy that rule anyhow.
I mean, it was a creative way of approaching that one case, but I mean, it's probably not applicable in a lot of other cases.
Okay. So there are various ways of getting your point across then.
Yeah.
Holograms, we have a few skeptics on those, but I think protests always will be and should be here to stay because it is a legitimate way for people to express their opinions. Strength in numbers, as they say. Okay, let's wrap up with our final headlines then. Anyone got one for protest culture?
I would say if you see something unfair, go to the streets and protest. And if you can't, send your hologram.
I'll also talk about protests. I'll quote my hero, George Orwell, from his book, Homer's Catalonia, about the war in Spain. And it's a quote that's always resonated with me. He said, "When I see a real flesh and blood worker locked in a conflict with his natural enemy, the policeman, I don't need to ask which side I'm on."
Okay. So moving on to our second topic then. I'm sure you've all heard the expression, he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. The old adage dates back to the European aristocracy when they used to use fine silverware, and children born into aristocracy used to be fed with silver spoons. But recently in Korea, people have been using this expression, but with a wider range of materials, including gold, silver, bronze, and even clay, based on their inheritance, and hence determining your social class. Let's take a look at the news coverage on this theory. The expression, born with a silver spoon in his mouth, is becoming a hot issue. The spoon class concept assumes a person's economic status is determined by their parents' assets. As the inequality of wealth becomes more evident, inherited assets play an important role in determining a child's quality of life. Recently, a student received sympathy for speaking up in an online community about being judged for being born with a clay spoon in his mouth and did not want his parents to find out. So why does being fed from a golden spoon make you more superior compared to somebody fed from a clay spoon? Is a question being asked by many. So the spoon class concept then, it explains how modern society is polarized based on your parents' wealth or your family wealth. This is evident not only in Korea, but in Germany, Sweden, and a lot of other countries as well. And the percentage of wealth that you inherit from your parents is said to be increasing these days. But if this phenomenon continues, do you think there'll be less and less opportunities for people to achieve social mobility by generating their own wealth?
Yes, I do think so. I think in Korea and in particularly in developed societies all over the world, we're seeing a lower percentage of people that are born into one income bracket or one social class, and then into their adulthood they enter another one. Mm-hmm. I think in a lot of places the wealthy pass down their wealth, and not just in terms of like the money that people inherit, but in terms of the opportunities that they're able to provide their children.
Right.
I think it's a right-wing fiction that poverty is caused by lack of effort. Yeah. I mean, I don't think there's any evidence for that. Yeah. And I think one thing we're seeing in Korea now, some disgruntlement with increasing amounts of like wealth that's passed on to generation and less social mobility, is for so long in Korea, like one of the stories that this society tells about itself is 노력, is effort. Is that like if you don't succeed, it's because you didn't try hard enough, and if you just work really, really hard, then you will be successful. But I think now we see people that are working very, very hard, but are not achieving the kind of success that they want.
Yeah, one of the most influential books last year was Capital in the 21st Century by Thomas Piketty, and he showed very clearly that we are gradually coming back to a society structure very similar to what happened last century, when basically the inflation rate was so low and you could just live at the interest of what the money you had. So basically you had like classes who stayed the way they were, like with what you inherited from your family, your parents, and you could continue to live very in the luxurious way and transmit your capital to your children. And now we are gradually coming back to this kind of society, which is extremely, extremely worrying. And one of the reasons is probably the neoliberal reforms that started in the 80s that are somehow encouraging this trend.
Well, I can disagree a little bit with that, because I think it will have a limit and it will have a turning point. Okay. Because I think the society in a free country can balance itself. I mean, for example, the rich people, they have like a really wealthy children, and those can have some wealthy children, but those people, they born rich, so they don't need a lot of effort to get more money or to try to be better. But maybe the people that gets in a more difficult environment will make more effort for their education, for work hard, and maybe they can raise up, and eventually the people that got really relaxed because they have a lot of money, they can just lose some wealth in favor of other ones that will make more effort.
Fred is already shaking his head.
I saw a study that was put out by Reuters, the news agency, within the past year, citing, I believe, an American financial consultancy, saying that 70% of rich families lose their wealth by the second generation, and by the third generation, it was, quote, doomed. So, I think there's, perhaps there's some evidence to show that while the first generation was industrious and made money through enterprise, that their children have been so spoiled and have been brought up not to have to actually fight and earn their own money, that they waste it, they spend it frivolously, and by the time they have children, then it's just wasted.
Okay, so let's carry on with this train of thought. A lot of people blame the governments, not just in Korea but worldwide, for allowing this phenomenon to happen, this spoon class concept. Do you agree with this? And if so, what can they do to alleviate these problems?
I think there's a long-term solution, and it goes through education, Okay. So if there are that difference in wealth is not this government's fault, is the past government's fault. So I think the government, what they should do is like invest much more money on education and give a really high quality public education to the children. So they would more or less start from the same level, or at least from a more similar level. And then the talent will say who is going up and who is just stuck.
So start with a level playing field.
Yeah, but the thing is, of course it's good, but that's not enough. There is the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu came up with this very interesting concept of cultural capital, meaning what you transmit to your children is not only wealth, but it's as well education, cultures, ideas, networks, way of thinking. You transmit a lot of things to your children that give them more chance to succeed in the future. It's not only wealth. So even if you put, even like for example in France, the education is free for everybody. And people don't go to Hagwon, to private institute. Like having money doesn't really make a big difference. But even despite that, we have a very unequal society, even despite the fact that education is free for everybody.
Well, I think if you look in a lot of cases, you'll see that in countries they have pretty decent laws about like preventing tax evasion and preventing like corporations from sheltering there. But in a lot of cases, like corporations and rich people just find ways around this stuff. So I think in a lot of countries you see a lot of progress made towards ending budget shortfalls and like having things be a little bit more even if these laws were actually carried out strictly. And so I think all governments would do well to maybe step up their enforcement measures and be clear that like these rules about taxes and corporate behavior are all being followed closely.
And it's funny to see the political manipulation in some of these things. I remember several years ago in the US, you had the inheritance tax that the conservative Republicans didn't like because they said it was too high. So they renamed it, rebranded it, and called it the death tax. And that just kind of the connotations referred to that you're being taxed for your parents' death. It turned some public opinion against higher inheritance taxes.
Decided by death panels.
Yeah. So there's often, unfortunately, depending on what politicians are in power at any given time, that these levels of tax, the ability for a government to track down tax evaders or paying less for inheritance, that can go up and down.
But Stephen raised a very interesting point. I agree. Government now, they don't have enough money to do correct social policies, to put enough money in education, to pay the professors enough. But on the other side, corporations are becoming richer and richer. And in Europe, we have this problem of Luxembourg, who somehow offered very, very good conditions to big international corporations to set up their HQ in Luxembourg, and in exchange they pay very little tax. And that's totally unfair. Luxembourg should not have done this. This is completely undermining the effort of all the other countries. And so far nothing happened. And the only thing that happened is the journalists that revealed this scandal, they are now having legal troubles, which I find it outrageous. And this is a really good point. I think states should do better effort to tax people or a corporation that refuse to.
Right, and then you have like a country like Ireland that is attracting all these American companies over there because of its low taxes. Apple's moved over there. I think the pharmaceutical company Pfizer is now moving over there. And right, that's just, these are American companies, but in order to avoid American taxes are moving overseas. It amazes, I don't know what the tax structure is in the European Union, but it amazes me how some countries can do this.
So there are quite a few measures that governments can take. Oftentimes they don't, though, for various reasons. But I think it's pretty vital that they take these measures as soon as possible, because this disparity in wealth is just becoming larger and larger as the years go by, isn't it? Okay, let's wrap up with our final headlines then. Anyone got one for protest culture?
I'd like to quote one of my heroes, an American lyricist, Christopher Wallace, also known as the notorious B.I.G., when he says, "Mo money, mo problems."
That's not always true.
Very deep.
Yeah, my headlines will be much more basic. To get a real equal society, governments has to do a lot of efforts.
Okay. I think once again our headlines cover the whole spectrum of concepts that we discussed today. Thank you so much, guys, for joining me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I will see you all next week.
See you.
Of course.
See you next week.
All right, I hope our viewers enjoyed the topics as well. Join us next week for a whole new global talk show, Newstellers. We will be open for any opinions or requests on our official website as well as our Facebook page.
Well, I'm working on a story about single mothers in Korea. They put on a play on Sunday, so I attended this play.
I'm headed back to Jeju-do to do a story about a Syrian man who's tried to escape the violence in their homeland by coming here, but are kind of caught in a limbo right now.
Story about the underground markets in North Korea. I'm trying to research some data, talking to some experts.
Preparing a story about this NGO in North Korea, and you know how difficult it is to work in North Korea. So I hope you'll be interested.